Over the last 2 sessions, 2 things became clear. First, where patient momentum breaks. Second, what protects it. We looked at the life cycle of patient relationships. How intent appears constantly inside a practice. A patient meaning to return. A referral waiting to happen. A relationship naturally trying to continue. And we also saw how fragile those moments can be. Without structure, intent fades, momentum slows, and what looked like demand becomes unpredictable. Day 1 showed the invisible revenue problem. Day 2 showed the architecture behind stability. By now, something should already be clear. Awareness alone doesn't create stability. Today moves to the final piece. Correct installation, not conceptually, operationally. Because understanding the structure is one thing. Installing it correctly is what makes it real inside the practice. By now, it should be clear none of this is random. Once you start mapping this, most practices reach a similar place. They understand what needs to happen. They see the structure. They recognize the gaps. But there is a difference between awareness and results. Because awareness does not make a system operational. Installation does. And that space between knowing and something actually holding inside the practice is where most practices get stuck. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they don't care, but because the distance between understanding something and operationalizing it is larger than it looks. And once that becomes clear, the question changes. From, do I understand this? To, what would it take to make this actually hold? Understanding architecture feels simple. At the concept level, it makes sense. The life cycle is clear. The pillars are visible. But installation is different. Installation is layered. And this is where most practices underestimate what's actually required. Not the idea, the depth. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they haven't seen what proper installation actually involves. Because once you move from concept to execution, friction appears. Triggers need sequencing. Timing needs calibration. Workflows need to support the system instead of fighting it. And that friction is where most practices stall. Not in awareness and execution. So the question isn't whether the ideas are sound. It's whether the architecture is being translated into a system that actually changes behavior inside the practice. That's the difference. Knowing creates clarity. Installing creates stability. When we say installation is layered, this is what we mean. Decision logic, conditional triggers, message sequencing, workflow alignment, staff alignment, timing calibration, testing and refinement. Each layer supports a different part of the life cycle, and each layer has to work with the others. Because this isn't something you turn on, it's something you integrate across the entire system. At the same time, this is the same life cycle we mapped yesterday, now viewed through implementation. And this is where most breakdowns happen. Not at the idea level, but where one layer fails to coordinate with the next. So, when practices say, "We tried something like this and it didn't stick," what they're usually describing is not a bad model. It's incomplete coordination across layers. When practices try to build this on their own, a predictable pattern usually shows up. The system gets partially built, and partial systems create noise, not results, or it becomes overcomplicated, something that requires constant attention just to keep it working. Sometimes timing is miscalibrated. Messages go out too early, too late, or too often. In other cases, the team resists. Not intentionally, but because the system adds friction to their day. And over time, usage becomes inconsistent. The system starts strong, then slowly drifts back to manual habits. Not because the idea failed, because the depth of installation was underestimated, and that distinction matters. The issue is rarely automation doesn't work. It's that the architecture wasn't installed deeply enough to remain stable under real-world conditions. Because understanding the system doesn't make it reliable. Installation does, and reliability is what creates consistency. On the surface, this feels simple. Send a text if a call is missed. But real systems don't operate at the surface. They operate on decisions. Is it during business hours or after hours? Is it the weekend? Is this a first-time caller or returning? Was a voicemail left? Has there been prior contact? Each of those conditions changes what happens next. And that's just one scenario. Now multiply that across the entire life cycle. Follow-up, referrals, reactivation, reputation, capture. That's not a single automation. That's infrastructure. And this is where the difference becomes real, not theoretical. Because stable practices don't rely on one rule. They rely on connected decisions working together. Now extend that same depth across every patient touchpoint. Reactivation has its own sequencing logic. Referrals depend on timing, milestones, and patient experience. Reviews aren't random. They're triggered at the right moment in care. Care plans require reinforcement based on behavior, not just time. And long-term nurture follows patterns, not schedules. Each of these has branches, timing windows, conditional logic. Because each pillar is protecting a moment we've already identified in the life cycle. And when they're connected, you don't get more complexity. You get structure, not complicated, layered. And that distinction matters. Because once it's seen as layered instead of overwhelming, it becomes clear why installation matters. Not because more theory is needed, but because the life cycle has to work as a sequence, not as fragments. At this point, you start to feel the tension. On one side, you want the outcome. Predictable patient flow, consistency, a system you can rely on. But on the other side, you can see what it takes. Structural work, not small work, layered. For most practices, this isn't something you casually piece together, and that tension is real, not fear, clarity. You're recognizing two things at the same time. You want the result, but you don't want to architect workflow trees, decision paths, and system logic. And that's rational, because those are two very different roles. And once that becomes clear, the question changes. It's no longer, should I care about this? It becomes, who should actually be responsible for building it? And that's a more mature question. Because practices don't grow by forcing every responsibility through the doctor. They grow by separating roles so the system becomes stronger than individual attention. This is where a distinction matters, because this is not clinical work. You were trained to diagnose, to treat, to build care plans that improve patient outcomes. That's your expertise. But life cycle architecture requires something different. CRM logic, trigger sequencing, system design, infrastructure for retention. And if this feels outside your lane, it is. And that's not weakness. That's specialization, which is why many practices try to solve this with effort instead of systems. More attention, more reminders, more manual work. But effort doesn't scale, and it doesn't stabilize. Modern practices don't confuse these roles. They separate them so each part of the system works correctly. And once that becomes clear, relief usually follows. Because the solution no longer depends on becoming excellent at something you were never trained to do. It depends on recognizing the difference between clinical excellence and operational architecture, and treating both with the seriousness they deserve. There's a cost that rarely gets discussed. Not in reports, not in dashboards. Mental supervision. Because when you build this yourself, you don't just install it, you carry it. You think about it constantly. Is it working? Did something misfire? Is the timing off? Did someone override something? And even when it's working, you're still monitoring it. And that creates something subtle. Cognitive load. And cognitive load reduces clinical focus because attention is finite. And every moment spent supervising systems is a moment taken away from patients. These are the same moments we quantified on day one, now viewed across the full life cycle. And this matters because the cost of weak infrastructure isn't just financial. It's mental, operational, cultural. It pulls attention away from the place it creates the most value. And over time, that becomes one of the hidden prices of carrying unstable systems manually. This is where many practices try to compensate. They monitor the system. They check triggers. They manage timing. They supervise the process. And for a short time, that can improve consistency. But there's a trade-off. Because attention is finite. And when attention shifts towards system monitoring, it shifts away from patient care. Not all at once, but enough to matter, which creates something subtle. Reduced clinical focus, increased mental overhead, and over time, operational drift. Because infrastructure is supposed to reduce cognitive load, not create new forms of it. The biggest risk is not trying this. The biggest risk is partial installation. Because half-built systems don't stabilize a practice. They create noise. Messages go out at the wrong time. Triggers misfire. Staff becomes uncertain about what should happen. Results become inconsistent. And something predictable happens next. Trust in the system erodes, which pushes the practice back to manual work. And when manual returns, variability returns with it. Not because the system doesn't work, because it was never fully installed. When installation depth is underestimated, this is the pattern that forms. At first, the system is attempted. New tools, new processes, new intention, and initially, it feels like progress, because nothing breaks. But the system doesn't fail clearly. It fails quietly. Then something small misfires. A message doesn't land right. Timing feels slightly off. The team hesitates. And confidence drops. Not all at once, but enough. And in that moment, manual feels safer. So, the practice reverts. Follow-ups become manual again. Tracking become manual again. Decisions become reactive again. And once manual returns, drift returns with it. Variability follows. Stress reappears. And without realizing it, the practice completes the loop right back where it started. Not because the system didn't work, but because it wasn't installed deeply enough to hold under pressure. If a practice decides to build this internally, the timeline extends far beyond setup. Because this isn't a single action. It unfolds in phases. Month 1 foundation, platform research, workflow mapping, message scripting, month 2 construction. Sequences are built. Timing is calibrated. Initial testing begins. Then month 3 and beyond, debugging, staff alignment, refinement. Systems don't just get built, they get adjusted. And that's assuming nothing breaks, no delays, no rework, no friction from daily operations. So, what looks simple on the surface quietly becomes months of coordination. And when you look at it clearly, you're not looking at days, you're looking at months. Most practices don't fail because they lack effort. They compensate. They grind manually. They run ads to cover gaps. They push harder when things slow down. And on the surface it works. Schedules fill. Patients come in. Revenue continues. But the real cost isn't failure. It's delay. Every month inefficiency continues, it compounds. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Quietly. Which makes it harder to feel, but not less real. Just like we saw earlier, small inefficiencies, repeated over time, create meaningful impact. And over time, that quiet compounding creates a gap between what the practice is doing and what it should be producing. That is why delay matters. Not because any single week feels catastrophic, but because each additional month widens the distance between effort and outcome. And that gap becomes expensive. Let's keep this simple and conservative. Not 5 patients, not 10, just 1. 1 missed patient per month. At an average patient value of $1,500, that's $18,000 per year. Not projected. Arithmetic. Now extend that over 3 years without correcting the system. $54,000 from 1 missed opportunity per month. And that assumes nothing worsens. No additional gaps, no increased inefficiency, just what's already happening. This isn't exaggeration, it's arithmetic. And arithmetic compounds whether you pay attention to it or not. And the point here is not to dramatize loss, it's to make the economics visible enough that the decision can be made rationally, Now expand that beyond a single point, because inefficiency rarely exists in isolation. It stacks. A patient who intended to return but never did. A referral that could have happened but didn't. A review that was never captured. A missed call. Unconverted interest. Each one small on its own, but layered together. They don't just add up, they accelerate. And that's what makes this difficult to see. It doesn't feel like one major problem. It feels manageable. But stacked inefficiency compounds faster than most practices realize. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Across the same life cycle stages we mapped on day 2. And once you see that the system becomes easier to diagnose, not because one gap matters most, but because together they create instability. And that's what stable practices work to remove. Money is measurable, but there's another cost most practices feel without tracking. The background hum of instability. When patient flow feels inconsistent, you compensate. You check dashboards, constantly, looking for validation. You watch ad spend reacting to fluctuations. You think about next month before finishing this one. Not because something is broken, because something feels uncertain, and that tension doesn't shout, it hums, and over time it drains focus, creates cognitive load, pulls attention away from patient care. This is what happens when effort replaces structure. And this is why stability matters beyond numbers. Because predictability doesn't just improve performance, it removes the hum. And that matters more than most practices realize. Because when everything requires attention, even small instability becomes exhausting. And calm is not a luxury here. It's a signal that the system is working. Instability doesn't just affect numbers, it affects people. When patient volume fluctuates, the entire practice feels it. During spikes, the team gets overloaded. Schedules compress. Care starts to feel rushed. And over time, burnout risk increases. During dips, the opposite happens. Staff becomes underutilized. Momentum slows. And a different kind of tension appears: uncertainty. But the most important part is quieter. Manual follow-up becomes inconsistent. Things slip. Small steps get missed. And frustration builds not all at once, but gradually. Because the team isn't operating inside a stable system. They're reacting. And over time, that variability becomes culture. And that's the opposite of the calm we've been pointing toward. Which is why infrastructure matters. Because consistency doesn't just stabilize numbers, it protects the people responsible for delivering care. And that protection changes how the practice feels, in ways metrics don't capture. This is where many practices start compensating. When infrastructure leaks, ads become the solution, not to grow, but to stabilize, to fill gaps, to replace lost volume, to smooth inconsistency. And over time, that becomes expensive compensation, not for demand, but for inefficiency. Now compare that to a stable system, where internal architecture protects the floor. Patient flow holds, follow-up holds, retention holds. And in that environment, ads play a different role. They amplify. They expand what's already working instead of trying to fix what isn't. Because ads can increase demand, but they can't correct structure. And when used as a crutch, they often mask the real problem, instead of solving it. And once that becomes clear, the role of marketing shifts. It stops carrying the burden it was never designed to carry. And that changes how the system performs as a whole. At this point, it's important to clarify the outcome. You don't want chaos. You want calm, not constant spikes, not unpredictable dips, not reactive decision-making. Calm, predictable bookings, patients returning consistently, reviews growing steadily, referrals happening naturally, a team that isn't buried but aligned with capacity, a practice that doesn't rely on dashboards to feel secure. That's the real target. Not viral growth, not short-term surges. Predictability, not because demand suddenly increased, but because it stopped leaking. Because operational stability is what allows everything else to work. And that matters, because calm is not just an emotional state. It's a business state, a structural state, a signal that patient flow is being protected consistently enough that the practice no longer feels like it's being run week to week. That is what mature infrastructure creates. There's an honest tension here. You want the outcome, but you don't want the build, because the build looks like this mapping workflow trees, writing long message sequences, testing trigger timing, debugging automation logic, training staff again and again, managing CRM complexity. And none of that is why you became a doctor. So the hesitation you feel here isn't resistance, it's clarity. Because this isn't your lane, and it shouldn't be. Your role is patient care, clinical outcomes, running the practice, not engineering lifecycle infrastructure from scratch. And that distinction matters, because once it's clear, the decision simplifies. Understanding the system is not the same as building it. Wanting stable patient flow is not the same as owning the technical work required to create it. Those are different decisions. And once you see that, you can evaluate the next step honestly. So the real question becomes simple. Do you build this or install it? Both are possible, but they are not the same path. Building requires time, mapping, scripting, testing, debugging, and then maintaining it. Installation is different. You're not creating the system, you're aligning it, plugging it in, calibrating it to your practice, and letting it run. Same outcome, different path, different demand on you. And that's the pivot, not effort, installation.